I'm happy to invite all of you here today, and we will go right into our topic. And the first question that we have here is, what has exactly changed in Canada-China relations as a result of Prime Minister Carney's visit to China? So perhaps, Julia, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much to the organizer, to ABMP, for providing this interesting opportunity for exchange. In answer to the question, Prime Minister Carney's visit to Beijing underlined the resumption of dialogue with China and announced a strategic partnership, chiefly emphasizing trade and investment. It also signaled a broader shift in Canadian foreign policy, as highlighted in his speech a few days later in Davos. This shift articulates Canada's quest to develop greater strategic autonomy and pursue more pragmatic, interest-based foreign policy in the context of global realities today and what Mr. Carney phrased as the rupture in world order. Beyond suggesting that canola and electric vehicles have replaced ping-pong diplomacy, Mr. Carney's visit facilitated the reinvigoration of a suite of consultation mechanisms between Canada and China, some of which have been dormant for a very long time. These serve as the practical building blocks of engagement. They help provide predictability and manage risk, and they facilitate raising sensitive issues behind closed doors. At the same time, they allow Canadian officials to better understand the Chinese government, why it behaves the way it does on bilateral, regional, and global issues. The resumption provides an important public signal that the Government of Canada recognizes that we must find ways of engaging effectively with China, given its political, economic, technological, and security influence. This visit also signaled the need for a shift in public discourse and media coverage of China, and that security should not be the primary lens through which every interaction with China is viewed. To achieve the promise of this re-engagement, we need to be savvy about the realities of China's impact in the world today, including right here in our universities, in our labs, within the private sector, and among our electorate. Today's panel invites us to consider reimagining engagement with China. To do so, we also need to reimagine how to cultivate the interest and skills to engage effectively with the Sinosphere, including China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Canada's national interests demands a new generation of Canadians with pertinent China competencies. Advancing this national interest compels us to find ways to help decision makers in the public, private, non-profit sectors so as not to be easily misled by uninformed, incomplete, or subjective views disseminated in both the mainstream media and social media or by individuals and organizations with ulterior motivations. So I'm really glad that stronger engagement and meaningful cooperation does not mean capitulation on human rights, and that sensitive issues such as human rights need to be discussed directly. And in exchange, we can expect China to raise its sensitive issues and to be prepared in our going forward how to factor this into our careful long-term incremental efforts that will be consistently made to reimagine constructive engagement with China.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to ABMP for organizing this event and for giving me the opportunity and giving CCBC the opportunity to be here. You know, in my own study of China and Canada-China relations, always relied on the work of people like Bernie and Jeremy Paul Teal here. So it's really an honor for me to be here now in this capacity and sharing some of our views, on behalf of the business community from CCBC with you. Julia provided a very comprehensive overview of what has been achieved during this trip and overall from this recalibration of relations. But if I want to kind of specifically point out and highlight some main achievements, the most important one from this particular visit, I think, is the agreement on the tariffs and counter tariffs. The impact on our agri-food industry, especially in the Western provinces, from those counter tariffs that were imposed from China on Canadian agri-food products, canola, seafood, others, it was significant. Year after year, relatively, we've had in recent years as well, even during this period of diplomatic strain in the relations, our exports to China relatively has increased. Slow rate, but it still has increased. But in 2025, after the imposition of those counter tariffs, we saw a clear decline in our agri-food exports to China, and it was a significant decline. Potentially, we may see, we don't have yet the full data for 2025 from Statistics Canada, but potentially our exports overall to China may have dropped slightly for the first year after a while because of those counter tariffs on agri-food. So definitely for our agri-food workers, companies, and businesses, what was achieved during this visit, the deal on the agri-food tariffs in return for a very calibrated, limited deal on access to our EV market, our car market, that was definitely a big achievement, and I would say a positive one for the Canadian economy and for Canada overall. But more broadly, really, this was a big milestone for Prime Minister Carney in his effort to re-engage and recalibrate Canada-China relations. And his effort is not just focused on China. If you focus, you see that, towards Asia-Pacific region, towards also India. Prime Minister Carney has been trying to recalibrate and re-engage with India as well, and overall take a more pragmatic approach in our foreign policy, in our trade policy, especially with the important need that we have right now, considering the tensions we face with the United States and our trade relations with them on diversification. Because of that diversification, everyone understands that we need to diversify our trade, given that Canada is significantly reliant on trade. And the Asia-Pacific region represents the most important region for that effort towards diversification. And 50% of the opportunities in the Asia-Pacific region is basically coming from the Chinese market. So that's why I think Prime Minister Carney started with that recalibration in our foreign policy and our trade policy, and the China piece has been a big part of that. So really the trip, the agreements reached, the mechanisms, the bilateral mechanisms that both sides have agreed to reconvene, EFSD, JETC, other dialogue mechanisms that Consul General Shamali and others pointed out to, those are now mechanisms that will allow us to move forward with a stronger bilateral relationship, make sure that we have the platforms needed, the building blocks to ensure that we can resolve some of the existing challenges, but also talk about opportunities that are there for both Canada and China to develop their business relations, people-to-people ties, education, collaboration, etc. Thank you.
Talk about those opportunities in the second.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I totally agree with what my colleague said. My first reflection on Carney's visit to China is the history is really repeating itself. Canadian government is among the first foreign countries to officially acknowledge the sovereignty of China's government. That's back to many, many years by Prime Minister Trudeau. But now, Canadian government do it again and take a very brave steps forward. I think what it changed is much more than a few thousand tons of canola oil and several thousand electric cars come to Canada. That's great. But much, much more important is Canadian government walk the walk. They are not just by saying so said, okay, let's taking down their sign from the window. Actually, they put Canadians' sign on the window. So this is the political and the policy and the long-term future or impact is we just began to see.
So I'm delighted that members of this panel are able to talk in depth about Canada-China relations. As somebody who's moved to this country 6 weeks ago, it's a question that I would struggle to answer with any depth. But there are some words that I've heard from the Consul General, but also from the panelists that I think ring true to me. One is around pragmatism in the relationship with China, and one is around realism. And I know that Mark Carney, when he was at the World Economic Forum, spoke about values-based realism. And I'm reminded of something that the Foreign Minister of Australia, the country that I hail from, actually says quite frequently. And it's the following. I have to read it so I remember what she says. She says, we need to cooperate where we can, disagree where we must, but engage in our national interest. And I think it's a lovely encapsulation of how we can frame a renewed sense of re-engaging with China.
Thank you. So now we can go, Julia, you can start. You want to reimagine, talking about reimagining the relationship. What would you say is the most important area? What's the strategic focus should be in this reimagination? And what would you particularly emphasize within it?
Thank you, Jeremy. I would particularly emphasize for Canada's strategy for re-engaging with China the practical capacity building initiatives to foster a nuanced understanding of the Sinosphere so that decision makers across education, research, business, and government have the ability to assess accurately the claims advanced about China and whether these claims are substantiated by the evidence provided. There's virtually no sector where we can afford to forego a sophisticated understanding of the intentions and actions of the Chinese party state apparatus, its military and defense capabilities, its state-owned enterprises, leading corporate and financial entities, and the role of China's subnational governments and non-state actors. However, it's vital that Canada's understanding and domestic narrative about China not be formed chiefly by security organizations or related concerns. We need to watch these issues, of course, as we do in our dealings with all countries. Having more exposure and more informed voices on Canada's interests vis-à-vis China will help us in shifting public opinion, which is currently one of the obstacles to productive exchange. Let's recall an earlier era of closer Canada-China collaboration when there were extensive contacts directly between a whole range of professionals, such as parliamentarians, political parties, the judiciary, the Bar Association, hospitals, schools, educators, scientists, entrepreneurs, engineers, and business people. These ties incrementally helped build mutual understanding and reduce the barriers of otherness, political and cultural bias, and assumptions founded on subjectivity. Against this backdrop, we need to recognize that re-engagement with China going forward will manifestly be different in nature from what it was in the past, where Canadians may have felt they had something to share or impart to Chinese counterparts. Today, in science, technology, innovation, and many other fields, China offers much from which Canadian institutions can learn, not to mention research funding and capital sought by Canadian companies. The guardrails identified by the Canadian government to restrict engagement with China in specific areas are reasonably narrow. Canada's trade commissioners, the Canadian trade commissioners at Canada's missions in China can be helpful in providing specific guidance on precisely what these restrictions entail and how to navigate them. These guardrails should not undermine constructive contact and engagement. To stimulate and sustain the interest of the private sector, Canada's strategy for re-engagement must include better publicizing how the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service can support Canadian companies free at both the pre-export stage and on the ground in China. And the perceptions of ordinary citizens are also important, and Canada's re-engagement strategy must take into account fragmented public opinion, the polarized media landscape, and interest groups who use the issue of China to advance their own agenda, not necessarily in the public interest. Cultivating public support will be crucial in reimagining effective approaches to Canada-China engagement that serve Canada's national interests. It will require extensive conversations beyond the usual elites to build ownership among ordinary Canadians, as well as those who feel vulnerable to the impact of increased engagement with China related to political and economic security, sovereignty, autonomy, immigration, jobs, artificial intelligence, foreign interference, and much more. Part of this work can be done by the Government of Canada in collaboration with business, universities, and other organizations, such as community groups and editorial boards. But cultivating public support in Canada also depends on the actions of China's government, its embassy and consulates in Canada, and of Chinese organizations and individuals who seek to shape Canadian public opinion, research and development, political and economic outcomes. To improve public perceptions in Canada of China will require thoughtful, long-term efforts by both sides.
Bijan, what is your imagination taking you, and where you at the CCBC hope to take this relationship next?
Sure. So I think the agreements reached already during this visit really provide a basis for what needs to be done in terms of the next steps. The dialogues that have been established they will provide both countries with ways to discuss the challenges, address them, and make sure that, you know, the situation that we've faced in the past 8 years hopefully don't happen again in near future. And also to talk about, you know, lowering those tariff and non-tariff barriers that are still there. For example, regarding, you know, we got access back for Canadian beef, but still Canadian pet food. There's conversation about that. There was conversation already about it during this visit. And I know that our officials and Chinese officials are working on that. So there are still things that, you know, based on the agreements reached, platforms and mechanisms created, the two governments are working together to resolve that will help Canadian businesses as well. And that will be, these steps will be crucial in making sure that this pragmatic engagement, and I call this strategy this pragmatic engagement. So some people talk about selective engagement as a strategy that we need to have with China. I think the selective engagement approach focuses more on the selective nature of it rather than the engagement part. But pragmatic engagement, I think, more captures what we really need to do when it comes to relations with China. And again, not just with China, but with other significant markets such as India as well. Now, guardrails and clarity. I think that is something that really our government needs to focus on. During this trip, with the roadmap, the agreements in the joint statement that was released, bilateral investment, for example, was highlighted as one of those areas that once again, we want to encourage Chinese companies to invest in Canada and for Canadian companies to go and invest in China as well. But the statements, the roadmap really just provided some high-level information, not a lot of details. Businesses are looking for the details to exactly have clarity, especially given the experience of the past 8 years. The experience of many Chinese investors that wanted to invest in Canada but had to deal with the very strict investment review process that was imposed on them, sometimes was politicized as well during the previous government. We're not going to get those investments we're looking for till we provide more clarity about our process. So if we are interested to get Chinese investors to invest in some of the major projects in the energy sector, for example, or get them to provide us with clean technology that we're looking for some of our infrastructure or energy infrastructure, et cetera, we need to provide the clarity that they need and assure them that we're actually interested in receiving that investment from China. And to be able to do that, I think one thing that we need to figure out here in our government is to make sure that this re-engagement, this pragmatic re-engagement, is not just, definitely it needs to be led by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, but it needs to be a whole of government approach, that all government departments, different sides of the governments, agencies, that they all support this effort. And that's something that perhaps we should improve on moving forward. You know, from the previous government, we had the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, there are different understandings and perceptions about the Indo-Pacific strategy, but definitely from perspective of any China expert, Canada-China expert you talk to, there is a disconnect between the current Prime Minister Carney's approach, that pragmatic engagement approach that I talked about, and the Indo-Pacific strategy approach to China. And there is that creates some disconnect in the government departments that want to work on Canada-China relations as well. So I think updating that, the Indo-Pacific strategy as a whole, or at least to understand that all government departments need to work based on this new strategy that we have, this pragmatic engagement with China, that will be helpful in moving things forward.
Okay, I think...
And I'm happy.
I just want to add something to this discussion. I mean, in both the Jia Chang's introductory remarks to this panel, and interestingly enough, in the GAC representative, Sharna's representative, they highlighted the research. But I noticed that in the joint communique and in the pillars that were given, science and research were not included. And so here, given this audience and this place, what can we do? And we have already mentioned what can we do to open areas of cooperation which have, over the last 6 years or so, been dominated by security and basically virtually cut off the potential for research cooperation. What can be done? What must be done in order to re-engage in some area to allow some, at least controlled, guardrailed, if you like, areas for collaboration and cooperation in the area of research, because we cannot have university cooperation without research cooperation. You can't separate the two. So what can be done? What must be done in order to do that?
Thank you, Jeremy. That's a really good introduction to the thing that I was going to say, as if you'd been mind reading me. I mean, my sense, so thinking about engagement with China at the level of a higher education institution, I don't permit myself to think about what the Canadian government might think. We know that reciprocity in the work that we do internationally is one of the key expectations of people that we work with around the world. And we commit to that. We make that commitment publicly in our global engagement. But I think we have to then think about what that reciprocity looks like in terms of our engagement with different countries. And closer government-to-government relations, of course, provides greater avenues for reciprocity. So if I look at it just purely through the lens of an institution of higher education, there is student flows in both directions. Students come in, maybe slightly reduced numbers for all sorts of reasons, which we'll get to later in this panel, I know. And students go out, and there are various initiatives that exist to enable students to travel to China to get that experience. We engage in the teaching of each other's countries. We, at this university, certainly have teaching of China and engaging with China in that kind of perspective. And we encourage the teaching of Canada in Chinese institutions. And again, we'll talk a little bit later about opportunities for engaging in teaching in China, which are new and actively encouraged, of course, by the Chinese government. But it is at this level of research engagement where reciprocity becomes much harder, because there are so many controls now on that research engagement. And again, I have not been in this country for long enough to talk about what those controls look like in a Canadian context. But in Australia, the interplay of foreign interference legislation on the one hand, and then dual-use technologies controls on the other, has led to significant clamping down of the capability of engaging with China in research. And again, I understand from my conversation at lunchtime with my colleagues that this is very similar in this country. And I think we do, therefore, need to think about how we enable reciprocity at this level of research engagement. I don't offer any solutions, not in the short term, but I'm hoping that my next panelist might.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Jeremy, I'd like to back to your previous question about once the door reopened, what would be the Canada strategy for the next step? I think Mark Carney said it very well. Canada is a stable and reliable partner. I think that's the key. We need to let our partner know we are stable. We are reliable. We will not change our policy in 2 years from now, and we will close the door again. That is very critical. Please, and keep the promise. Reliable and stable. That's the first thing from the government level. But then again, we cannot just sitting here, the whole house of leaders in all walks of life, just waiting for government to change or not change. We need to do our own share. During the cold time, when the Canada-China relationship hit the block, ABMP is a great example to study. What ABMP did, if you forbidden the intellectual exchange, we will be creative and resilient to open other channels, such as online training, such as expand our education mandate from one area to other area. York University did a great job during those cold time. Even when the government implemented the policy prohibit many ways exchange, York University leadership continues to visit Chinese embassy and invite Chinese diplomat to the campus, welcome Chinese student, support Chinese scholar. This is the way we can do. We need to lobby the government, but we cannot just sitting there, wait for government, tell us what to do.
Now, I would like any panelists who want to comment further to come in now, and then I'll open up the floor for people to ask questions.
So on the education, I think, Douglas, you pointed out to the main items that I wanted to mention as well. I think in the education, we have different buckets, as you pointed out, to the international students, so the recruitment piece, and then the partnership piece. On the international recruitment piece, one of the challenges that in recent years we face in Canada is that because of the negative media environment, the negative public discourse around China, a negative perception has been created in China about whether kind of questioning parents who want to send their kids to Canada, questioning whether Canada is still a welcoming place for their sons and daughters to send them here to continue their education. That is definitely, I think, something that CCBC, universities and colleges together with government, we need to work on. And definitely with the different approach of this government, I think already we're seeing a shift, especially if we can kind of make sure that the visa processing issues and challenges are addressed as well. Then that will definitely help us in making sure that we continue having access to the top Chinese talent that we want to attract, our universities want to attract to Canada. On the research piece, I think the big problem we have is, of course, we want to have guardrails. Of course, we want to protect our national security. But how those guardrails are defined? Are we going to kind of broadly ban, for example, Chinese researchers, the collaboration with Chinese researchers in engineering, science, and technology fields? Or are we going to really be narrow in terms of defining those items, those fields, type of research that because of American concerns, let's be honest, because of that, or because of our own national security, we need to kind of limit that. And really, we need to be narrow in selecting those areas and working with our researchers to make sure that they have the academic freedom and the room to maneuver and work with their Chinese partners on research side as well. So that's on the research piece, and then on the business development. I think one issue that we need to realize is that business development in China is very much connected to government relations and government engagement. So both investing from the Canadian government side, investing in the business development efforts of our Canadian exporters, that is important, but also making sure that whenever, for example, a simple action that we need to make sure of, and hopefully we had that chance, for example, last month with Prime Minister visit, to make sure that whenever there is a leader's visit to China, ministerial visit to China, that there is a major business engagement effort well coordinated in advance as well, so that Canadian businesses can really benefit from these engagements. These visits provide opportunities, create opportunities for Canadian businesses. And we want to make sure that our business community can take advantage of those and benefit from them.
I might just say a quick word before I pass to Julia. So again, today's panel is not the right place to have a conversation about the neo-colonial and extractive nature of full fee paying international education. It's a conversation we should be having, and it's a conversation that other countries do have. So taking the best and brightest and the wealthiest students from around the world to come here to study, there are other opportunities to engage students around the world. And again, the Chinese government, through its Minister of Education, provides incredible opportunities for universities like York to establish joint education programs and joint education institutes in China. And again, we see this as a growing area of focus for the Chinese government. So if we're talking about reciprocity, this is something that we know that we're encouraged to do. Unsurprisingly, given things that are happening in the country just to the south of here, the number of new Chinese joint education programs approved in the last round in September last year was significantly up, and very few of them are in the US. So again, this is where I think, coming back to Mark Carney's kind of reflections on middle power, there is an opportunity for those of us that might describe ourselves as middle powers to actually lean into this encouragement now to collaborate in a new world order. So again, I'll just throw that one down there.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad to see that my fellow panelists have covered some of the points I was planning to touch on. So I'll shorten what I was going to say. But I would like to touch on something which I think hasn't been addressed explicitly. And that relates to, we need a nimble strategy for nurturing a new generation of China experts, accompanied by efforts to provide decision makers in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, as well as universities, with a more sophisticated understanding of the Sinosphere on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. This will help shift public discourse and media coverage of Canada's engagement with China. As Shamali said, the Prime Minister's visit to China signaled that the recalibration of Canada's relations with China will include increased people-to-people ties, such as education and culture. If we expect education exchanges to follow, attention is needed by the governments of both Canada and China to create conducive conditions for Canadians to consider China as a safe destination for study, teaching, and research without undue constraints. Currently, there are constraints on both the Canadian and the Chinese side. We need active encouragement by the Government of Canada in concert with provinces, universities, and colleges, outlining the conditions under which Canadians are encouraged to pursue academic and research endeavors in China. This involves providing far greater clarity on the parameters of security considerations and clear signaling that such academic engagement by Canadian individuals and institutions is not by default considered high risk. Beyond establishing the necessary clarity, as Bijan said, federal and provincial governments and educational institutions also need to provide funding and incentivize such collaboration to underpin re-engagement. As Bijan said, Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, announced in 2022, needs to be revised, given how the world has changed since it was drafted. A 5-year review was in any case anticipated, and this should now factor in the evolution of Canada's foreign policy and national security strategy. To be clear, even if the IPS, the Indo-Pacific strategy, is revised in this way, hesitancy will remain among some Canadians in the absence of greater clarity and transparency on the Chinese side about the scrutiny and surveillance imposed either overtly or covertly on international visitors. As I said, with respect to shifting public opinion in Canada, shifting the approach to education collaboration is not something Canada can do alone. To improve perception in Canada of the attractiveness of China as a safe and rewarding destination for study, research, and teaching will require long-term, thoughtful efforts by both sides. More specifically, restoring confidence and stimulating interest in education exchanges with China among Canadians also depends on the actions of the government of China, its embassies and consulates in Canada, its universities, labs, and research institutions, which need to be seen to be acting in good faith, respecting academic freedom and academic integrity. Expectations for the Prime Minister's visit to China were deliberately set low and transactional, and they were exceeded. Perhaps the same approach will serve Canada well in re-engaging with China. And if there's interest during the question period, I'd be happy to share examples of collaboration between government and universities, which are intended to cultivate precisely the type of China competencies I'm advocating. And this includes an example involving Professor Bernie Froelich.
I think Ray wanted to.
Can I just give one example, because I think this is a really good, tangible example of where this is already happening. So there's an initiative in this country called the China Learning Initiative in Canada, which has been, I think, if I understand correctly, a U15 university reserve. So an opportunity for students to receive funding to travel to China on exchange. And the U15 is opening that up, or the initiative is opening up, I think, with the guidance of the consulate. And again, York has just signed up to be a member of that. We know that we have more demand for our students to go on placements to China. So again, it's one small example, maybe a ray of hope around re-engagement at the level of students.
I'd like to make some further comment on the research collaboration and the national security issue. National security is nothing new, nothing unique. It's applicable to every country. Canada has national security, China has national security, America has, every country has, and it's rightful. They should have national security concern. In Toronto, we just went through several winter storms. Everyone shoveled their snow out of their driveway. I may throw the snow to my neighbor's driveway. My neighbor may throw their snow back and said, "Don't put snow here, this is my sovereignty." All rightful to do it. But the question is how to do it and how to define it. National security is really dynamic and evolving issue. We all know TikTok. TikTok in Canada was originally banned by government for the national security concern. January 2026, Superior Court suspended that ban, said the government decision has no foundation. We need to further study. Now you see who defines national security? And we believe once there's a policy, there's law, there's a regulation we should follow. Not necessary. It's dynamic. Now also, when the national security come along issue, what we should do, if it's law, if it's a policy regulation, there's no doubt we need to follow. We need to absolutely follow. But then again, this is a bi-directional issue. As I said, the neighborhood threw away snow to their driveway. It's a bilateral issue. And I can give you the example. In China, national security is also tightened up in recent years, very tight up. And they try to find spy and jeopardize national security from foreign influence, the same thing. And they also have the right to do it. But we as scholar, researcher, so what we should do, national security should be never an excuse to stop international collaboration. It's how to define it, how to implement it. Give you another example. The watch list, or I call it the blacklist, for Chinese university is almost forbidden to interact and directed by government, Canadian government. Now, what is the rationale to determine that list? Who said which university should be on the list? Once on the list, what we should do and what we cannot do. That implementation and determination are very critical. Put on one side, national security, yes. Put on the other side, research collaboration, still critical needed. So I think that they are not conflict as really. It's the right thing to do. But we need to find the balance to benefit for everyone.
Thank you very much. I will open up the floor for questions. Perhaps you could take 3 questions first.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful discussion. I'm Xiaolin Wei from the Dalai Lama School of Public Health, University of Toronto. So my question would be how we should really re-evaluate our national security and national interest to allow better collaboration for the benefits of the next generation of Canadian students.
I want to take 2 more questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for this interesting discussion. My question is to Bijan. Bijan, CCBC is more than 40 years old organization. And in your role as a CEO of this organization, how do you see the improvement of relation between Canada and China impacting the role of CCBC? Thank you.
I just wanted to ask the panel, we hardly heard anything about America, the United States reaction to this new Canadian initiative. We know that the President of the United States was initially extremely upset over this, and he said—
Initially said it was okay, and then he said—
Yeah, if this continues and we explore a deepening of this relationship, there would be major trouble for Canada. So my question is, there are 2 partners here, but there's actually a 3rd partner, the United States. How are we going to deal with that?
Okay, so let me address the first one, the national security definition, especially in relation to Canada-US side. And we all know BlackBerry is a Canadian product, never banned by American for national security reason. TikTok is software, is developed by China, is banned by Canadian government. It's both the stance is based on national security. National security largely is political, culture, ideology driven, not by technology driven. And so it's now we all often say Canadian scholar want to do the international collaboration with American scholar. When that collaboration initiated, there's no issue. Doesn't matter US or Canadian government. No one said, oh, your collaboration is national security concern. And American universities, the top 10 should be on our watch list, or Canadian top 5 should be on American top list. That's very kind of a provoking thinking. Why so? It's because both countries don't see their national security is jeopardized. However, things may change. As Mark Carney said, we have a new world order. The power cannot just ruling the powerless people. Our national security is jeopardized by our cross-border relationship. I think so. Otherwise, why we were constantly called the 51 state? That's national security. So this is when declares that one, Canada should treat all countries the same. Should treat all the country if the national interest involved, is national security involved, regardless of your culture, background, politics, ideology, national security is national security. I just want to cross-border, transparent, fair treatment.
So first talk about this question, the role of CCBC. So really, our role is two sides into it. One is helping the businesses on both sides, especially Canadian businesses. And about 80% of our members, they're SMEs. 20% of them are major Canadian corporations, 80% SMEs, helping them on the ground in China, connecting them with potential customers and clients, training them, the ones that are just, exploring the market in China in terms of the information they need, the knowledge that they need on how to establish their business in China. So a lot of the work that we do is facilitating those business-to-business connections, but also depending on the policy environment of the day, representing the business community in front of both governments, helping the businesses in terms of their government relations, and providing recommendations to both governments on how they can improve the situation for the bilateral business relationship. Prime Minister set an ambitious goal, but we think an achievable one in the visit that he had to China, expanding Canadian exports to China by 50% by 2030, I believe was the year that he mentioned. So that is really now a goal for us as well, to work with the Canadian business community that is doing with business with China to achieve that goal. So that will be our focus for the coming years, but it's not, our focus is not just on trade, so export and import, but also on bilateral investment as well. And that's a big piece of the relationship that we need to also work on, and we're working on that. About the elephant in the room, the United States and our national interest. Of course, Canada needs to identify, Canadians, define their national interests and issues of national security. So we need to define that based on our vision for Canada and our own interests. But the reality is, and that's, we talk about pragmatic engagement, the reality is that the relationship with the United States, because of it has a significant and outsized impact on everything that we do, on any relationship that we have with the rest of the world. And definitely we're living in a period that is called by experts an era of great power competition. So that great power competition is going to impact our relationship with China. And that is perhaps managing the relationship with US and its impact on our relations with China is the biggest challenge that the current Canadian governments and any future one, at least till this rivalry, this strategic rivalry is taking place, will face in managing the bilateral relations with China. How should we manage the relationship? It's a very good question, but I don't think anyone has a good answer for it yet in Canada, or even among our other countries that we consider them our allies and partners. But there are lessons we can learn. For example, Australia, I think, is a country that has been more successful in compared to us in managing business relations, for example, with China, maintaining strong business ties with China, and at the same time have strong security alliance with the United States as well. They're also a Five Eyes partner. They're an AUKUS. We're not. So because of so that is, for example, one case we can look at and learn from in terms of how what sort of strategies do we need to have around managing the competition between US and China, and keeping still a good relationship with China while maintaining our alliance with the United States as well. But the CUSMA review that is upcoming, that is perhaps a very important milestone for this government in terms of the pressures that most likely we will be under in terms of some of the restrictions that the Americans may want that we impose on our relationship with China. But I hope that the tensions that we have faced in this second Trump administration and the first Trump administration have been a wake-up call for our decision makers in Canada, that realizing that we need to diversify our trade. We cannot be so over-reliant on one country, on one trading partner, because that is also a matter of national sovereignty, a threat to our national sovereignty, a threat to our national security. So I hope that wake-up call will make us more aware of the importance of diversification, the importance of ensuring that we do not align ourselves 100% on what the United States want us to do, but leave room for cooperating with other partners, including with China. Thank you.
Bernie, I'm also going to try and answer your question from an Australian perspective. And again, Bijan, thank you for highlighting, Australia's role in this. I won't talk about the AUKUS initiative, which is extremely controversial back in Australia, but anyway, we'll leave that one to one side. I think what I found fascinating with Mark Carney's speech at Davos was how widely it was reported around the world. And again, there were many in Australia that reflected, oh, wouldn't it have been wonderful if our Prime Minister had had the courage to stand up and say that kind of thing on the world stage. So this is how these things are reflected in other countries. Australia itself is a middle power. I've just 6 weeks in this country. There are incredible similarities between these two countries. But the fundamental difference is that Australia is an island a long, long way from anywhere else. And so it doesn't rub shoulders with a great power. And yet this country, as by my limited understanding, has been rubbing shoulders with the great power from its birth. And that then changes the nature of the middle power status of Canada. So again, I'm not going to offer any kind of advice to the Canadian government about how it should do this. But I think these reflections on what it means to be a middle power in today's world. Bernie, you were talking about 3 people in this relationship, and I very much feel that here, the weight, the pressure of the US and its proximity. And you don't feel that when you live in Australia. You don't feel that in the same way. I think the weight is still there, but you don't feel that pressure in the same way.
You'll be delighted to know I have nothing to add to what my fellow panelists have already said.
If I may be allowed to say something. I mean, I think obviously one thing that's come out of this discussion is that we can no longer allow our national security to be defined in Washington. Yeah. And so the question is, if it can't be defined in Washington, where and how should it be defined? And there are a couple of things that come to mind. Obviously, there are own other, but there are. I mean, we talk about the relations. There are trans-border supply chains, and obviously those do need to be secured. So, I mean, that's one way of narrowing the whole question about security and research security. Okay, where there are transnational supply chains involved, then we will definitely adhere to security concerns that come out of our partners. But where there are not trans-border supply chains, that's a different matter entirely. Or if we're talking about basic science, it should not. I mean, one of the things that's come out of Washington is that it seems like everything that is world frontier science is itself national security. Should we define all frontier science as being an America-centric sphere from Canada's point of view? That's a question that we have to define. Our universities will have to define for ourselves. And the government needs to clarify how it stands in relation with that. So clearly, yes, there are some areas which are dual use, some areas which are frontier areas which have transnational spillovers. But what about other areas? Basic science, simply frontier science for the sake of frontier science. Is that necessarily a national security concern to be defined because American universities are at the frontier? That's a question we have to ask.
Jeremy, I might come back to a point that was made earlier on. In the conversations that I have with people about the work that I do in higher education, I generally find that outside of a higher education sphere, people have no idea about how universities work. how research is done, how it's funded, what the considerations are, what academic freedom means, what a foreign interference legislation might mean for us. So again, we are a little bit alone in that. And I think there is a really pressing need, and it comes back to something that Julia said earlier on, a pressing need for us all collectively, but I'm thinking just from a university perspective, to help our broader communities understand the world in which we're operating, which is no longer, I would say, in my line of work, a nationally focused Ontario, but we're an Ontario-based institution with an Ontario history, but we are engaged globally in the work that we do. And that global engagement therefore brings with it a set of strictures and considerations around national interests, national policy. And I think we need to help our communities, and by that I mean all of the people that we engage with in local governments, in our alumni community, in the broader, parents and friends, all of these people, to understand what that means. And I don't know that we do that particularly well, because I think we tend to keep our global activities off to one side. We do them, but we don't talk about them. We talk about something successful like a ranking. We might talk about that, or a major initiative, or we got lots of money to do something. We don't talk about the why. Why did we do this? Why is it important for a higher education institution or an institution of higher learning to actually engage in this way? And so again, that's the challenge that I think we face across the sector, not just in New York, to actually think about how we re-envisage that communication and that conversation, because that will help in a very trickle-up way, will help a national conversation about research interest.
I want to echo something that Julia already said. Reciprocity from China will help. That is to say, as long as China sees frontier science as self-sufficiency, that undermines collaboration. And so we need better communication from China about collaboration at the frontier and being as an interest of all, also in order for us to be able to better communicate our desire for collaboration. So I think, there is a role for China to play in helping the atmosphere.
Can I add something, please,
Yeah.
Jeremy? So I think there are a number of efforts that have been made by Global Affairs Canada to start those kinds of conversations. And one of the docking points for that is within our foreign ministry, the Center for China Policy Research, which has a whole range of initiatives, which include outreach to experts outside of government, including in the academic sphere. You won't be surprised that I have several bullets on this, but I'm not going to tell them to the group. What I am going to say is we have a very good example of how this can be done in terms of collaboration between government and academic institutions, and how this can be really helpful for shaping the views of the people who participate in these kind of programs, and it can have an impact for the entire duration of their lifetime and their careers. So the example I'd like to cite is one from before I joined the diplomatic service, when I worked for 5 years for the Ontario government, building relations between Ontario and the Chinese province of Jiangsu. Arguably, one of the most long-lasting impacts of this twinning relationship was the Ontario-Jiangsu Education Exchange Program. And it enabled the exchange of university students and faculty from Ontario and Jiangsu from a whole range of institutions, the leading universities and some fairly ordinary colleges across the board. It was very open-ended. And similarly, from the Jiangsu side, a wide range of institutions at a time when this was not common. And the point I want to make here is several of my colleagues in Canada's public service in several different departments honed their China competencies through this Ontario Jiangsu program. Professor Bernie Frolick led the implementation on the academic side of this program, while I was the anchor for it for the Ontario government. And it gives me particular pleasure to be here today, marking 40 years of personal and professional collaboration with Bernie.
York University is the host shepherd institution for the exchange programs that exist under the Ontario government scheme. At this point in time, they are an exchange scheme long-standing with Germany, with the state of Baden-Württemberg, and with France, with the Région Rhône-Alpes. But again, we have, for those that don't know, we're delighted to confirm that the Ontario government has just renewed funding for that program for the next 3 years. And in terms of reimagining engagement with China, I'm very happy to take that flame up with the Ontario government around the opportunity to re-engage with its own sister province, which is Jiangsu province, in China around an exchange program of that nature. So again, I'm very happy to do that and to commit to that today.
We can take maybe one more question.
Just before the pandemic, speaking of the OJS program, Student Mobility Program between Ontario and Jiangsu, there were more Ontario students going over to Jiangsu than the incoming Jiangsu students to Canada, just right before the pandemic.
Yeah, this is Tracy. I'm from Swan Academy. I just also not only question, but we are actually the program coordinator for the Jiangsu programs, like working with Ontario for many years ago. And I have very good news to share that the Jiangsu province and some other institutions are reaching out to us again. They are inquiring more students, university students, as well as teachers and other researchers to be sent to, Ontario to do exchange program, learning program again. So we appreciate all the professors' help.
I'd like to point out that in the communique and in the government program, it does encourage subnational government cooperation.
Yes.
So there is a green light from the federal government to re-engage at that level. That needs to be taken up by the provincial government.
Yes, yes. Many years ago, Jiangsu province through Swan Academy, we actually have over thousands of trainees standing here. They live in our residence building, and we are very looking forward to see it happening again. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.